So now we're just going to have three very short talks, but we thought it was very important that you actually heard from some local women. So first up is Alice, and she's going to talk about the impact of self-ID on lesbians.
Right. Oh, me thank you back there. When I was in my 20s, which was in the 1970s, I knew that it was dangerous to be obviously a lesbian in certain contexts. I never held hands in the street with a girlfriend, and I did know women who'd been very seriously attacked just for being obviously lesbians. We worked very hard to change these attitudes, and gradually things got better, even for lesbian mothers who did have a hell of a bad time, losing kids and so on. I thought that while a bit of prejudice was bound to continue, we were on the road to simple acceptance. How wrong I was. 50 years later, young lesbians are bullied and mocked, told they're really men and should transition. All the lesbian support groups set up back in the 70s and 80s are gone. The organisations that used to support us now focus on transgender people. Recently, Michael Biggs from Oxford University's Department of Sociology counted the use of the words lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans in the... Is that okay? Yeah, great. Those words in the annual reports of 3 LGBT supporting UK organisations over the last 5 to 18 years. In every single case, the frequency of the word lesbian had decreased from over 25% to negligible numbers and sometimes 0, while trans had grown from under 10% to over 50%. Young lesbians search out groups and organisations in hope of finding a welcoming environment, but most are now identified as queer and regard trans as the most praiseworthy identity. So just at the moment that a girl is trying to discover her sexuality, she finds that she's expected to believe that her non-compliance with stereotyped gender expectations means that she is trans and really a heterosexual man. Girls and young women are told they're so brave and wonderful for daring to be their so-called authentic selves when they start to wear binders designed to crush their breasts flat so they can appear male. Such binders restrict breathing, sometimes lead to broken ribs, and can cause serious damage to breast tissue and blood vessels. Several UK-based organisations provide free binders to girls and young women who request them, and they're available on Amazon from £3 to £20, advertised for trans lesbians and tomboy lesbians, although the smaller print refers explicitly to female to male transgender. And then there's testosterone, which many young women take as they try to become men. It's relatively easy to acquire online, and despite assurances that the changes are all reversible, for many who've taken it for any length of time, the effects, particularly the changes to voice and the hair growth, will not go away when self-medication ceases. We're now beginning to hear the voices of detransitioning young women, accepting their lesbian selves, and some of these stories are really painful to hear as they come to terms with their mutilated and sterilised bodies that cannot be restored to what they once were. A further threat comes from those trans rights activists, not transsexuals, obviously, as you heard from 7hex, who respect women's boundaries, whose male heterosexual orientation towards women simply continues when they declare themselves trans women and then call themselves lesbians. When I was young, men who claimed to be lesbians were a staple of jokes, and even the men making such claims weren't serious. But the activists think it is entirely reasonable to call themselves lesbians, even when they retain their male genitalia, as most do. They regard lesbians who rule out having sex with trans women as transphobic, prejudiced, and in the same camp as someone who says they'd never have sex with someone of a different skin colour. Very confusing for young women. And 7hex mentioned the cotton ceiling, And this is the idea that, you know, like with the glass ceiling, that somehow lesbians won't let trans women move any further, and we get referred to as vagina fetishists, and there are articles explaining to lesbians how to have sex with a female penis. Apparently quite unlike a male one. One of the things that really upsets me is that there are policies put in place in many services to prevent what's called gay conversion therapy, and they've now been adapted to mean that anything other than total acceptance of someone's self-declaration as trans is regarded as conversion therapy. So this is pretty hard for, you know, psychotherapists, counsellors, etc. I'm just amazed that the tea has been packaged with the LGB, and yet what's actually being promoted is a deeply homophobic attitude, and I'm really concerned about the attitude, about the impact on lesbians of the whole ideology of trans rights activism. Our culture's being obliterated, lesbian figures from the past are having their histories rewritten, and we're going to go on protesting.
Thank you very much, Alice, that was fantastic. And now I'm going to hand you over to Meg, and Meg's going to talk about some of the reasons that people have been re-evaluating their previous understanding of the transgender debates, through her own personal journey, which I think starts in 1997.
Hi. It was 1997, and I lived in a vibrant city with an active LGB scene. Drag was popular, and transsexual males in particular were suddenly visible. I had no reason to doubt that transgenderism was just the next form of liberation to address. But I was a feminist at heart, alert to the ways women could be turned against themselves. So, when lesbian friends suddenly started to declare themselves trans men, something gave me pause. Previously proud, butch lesbians, women who, to my eyes, had nothing in common with the straight men who caused them so much trouble, were hooking up with communities of trans people and identifying suddenly, and en masse, as straight men. Why, I wondered, were they rejecting their female bodies and instead identifying not just with, but as their oppressor? Dislike, even extreme, consistent discomfort with one's body, I could empathise with. Like many women, I have never known a moment's peace with my body. But surely the feminist response was that we should change the social expectations, not correct our bodies with surgery. But it seemed the message to young butch women was, if you can't be feminine, fix your bodies and be men instead. That struck me as both homophobia and misogyny. But I sensed my concerns would not be welcome, so I kept my silence. The T was now part of the LGB. The narrative was one of liberation, and nobody wants to be thought a bigot. In 2004, the Gender Recognition Act was going through Parliament. I had concerns. Shouldn't vital forms like birth certificates be based on truth? What unforeseen consequences might there be? Did I discuss them? No. I told myself to be kind and accepting, and I kept my silence. In 2015, the language of gender ideology was a hot topic on Women's Hour. We were informed that we must call ourselves cis women in order to acknowledge our privilege in relation to trans women. So, menstrual stigma, forced marriage, sexual violence, oppressive stereotypes, the sex pay gap, all the many injustices, major and minor, that the female sex has endured because of our very femaleness. These now constituted a privilege. We were being asked to define ourselves in relation to our acceptance of the prescribed gender roles that our foremothers had fought against, to identify as comfortable with our oppression. It jarred with me, but silently. Women's Hour next named a male in the top 10 of their Women in Power list. Caitlyn Jenner, the retired decathlete formerly known as Bruce, had made a great deal of money and fame as a male athlete. But Jenner had earned this particular accolade, it seemed, by posing in a basque on the front cover of Vanity Fair, alongside a coming out story about transitioning. Was this not true privilege? To enjoy decades of wealth and celebrity due to one's male physique, only to take a place on a list intended to celebrate female achievement with a pornified performance of femininity? Suddenly we were being asked to accept ideas that ran contrary to our whole understanding of biology without question, to sign petitions to transfer trans-identifying male prisoners to female prisons, to drop the language of female anatomy, even though the ability to accurately name our anatomy is fundamental to our health and safety. We were told to say chest feeding, birthing person, and front hole. It was 2017, a full 20 years since I first questioned the impact of transgenderism on women, before I discovered that other women shared my concerns about women and children, the impact on young lesbians, the disregard for freedom of thought, and the aggressive manner in which discussion was being shut down. Abuse and threats met those who spoke openly. People urgently needed to become informed about these issues, but were unable to do so because there were real risks to the safety of those who discussed them. The left-wing media and all political parties were avoiding all hint of dissent. There was a real climate of fear. I spoke to nobody. Until finally, my husband asked to know what was making me so worried. I broke my silence and told him about a serious threat made to women in London who wanted to meet and talk at Speaker's Corner of all places. I had told him my worries and he didn't think me a bigot. He shared my doubts and wanted to know more. Breaking a silence is a powerful action, but so is keeping a silence. Silence is not neutral. It contributes to that climate of fear. When we communicate, fear dissipates. Since 2017, women have risen up and demanded a voice. Grassroots organisations have worked hard to turn the tide. I finally voiced my concerns to friends and family and my MP. Yes, some thought I had turned into a bigot overnight, but mostly people joined in the conversation. We took to the streets. I got chatting to a trans rights activist, and we actually found some common ground. The GRA consultation may have been intended as a formality, but women talking have changed that. Prison policy is being reviewed. Women speaking out has changed that. Above all, women have helped each other to find our voices. Our silent acceptance can no longer be taken for granted. Women will speak about the issues that affect us. There will be nothing about us without us.
Thank you so much, Meg. That was brilliant. And lastly, we've got Diane, and Diane's going to talk briefly about the policies of political parties, and then we're going to open it up to the floor and hopefully some interesting questions from yourselves.
Thanks, Libby. I've reduced this to hopefully 5 minutes from very much longer, and I'm not sure if Libby said this, but I mean, although we've talked about a lot this evening, there's an awful lot more, and I think we will be sending everybody more information about what I'm going to talk about and probably other aspects. So, political parties. Well, most of this will be about Labour Party policies because I'm a socialist. I have been a Labour Party member for a long time. I've actually left the party because of this issue when they retweeted the Stonewall link to the government consultation. But I'm still, I probably will rejoin if they come to their senses, and I still work towards trying to get the policy changed. So from my perspective, this all started with Stonewall's change of focus in February 2015, when, having made some excellent gains for lesbians, gays and bisexuals, they decided to focus on trans rights. And one of the priorities that they adopted in February 2015 was to change laws in relation to trans. So they're in full-on lobbying mode, and by September that year the Tories had set up the Women and Equalities Select Committee inquiry into transgender equality. Many women submitted observations and opinions and information to that inquiry, but no women's organisation was invited to give oral evidence to the inquiry, which was very, very significant because it's that evidence that is given most credence. Maria Miller, the minister, was very, very dismissive and referred to purported feminists who claimed that the proposals would have an impact on women. If I run out of time, I'll just say she has stepped back from that to some extent and announced that they're not totally committed to self-ID, which is quite a significant shift. And as Meg says, I think that must be at least in part, if not majorly, attributable to the work that women have done to get that opinion changed. So in April 2017, there's a snap election announced, so the Labour Party needs a manifesto in a hurry, and the recommendations from the aforementioned Select Committee inquiry, that's the one that didn't get any input or didn't accept any input from women, was just dropped into the Labour Party manifesto. The particular words that made such a difference. There was nothing in the 2015 manifesto about trans rights at all, but in 2017 they committed to changing the Equality Act to substitute gender identity for gender reassignment as a protected characteristic. Now that is a massively significant shift. I suspect that probably most of the people in the room where they were considering the draft manifesto wouldn't have actually understood what the significance was. Some will have, those that were already advocates of Stonewall policy will have known and will have been pushing for it, but I suspect that most wouldn't have known at all. And there was no debate. I mean, I know from somebody who was in that room, there was no debate on the question. And personally, I was oblivious to all of this until November 2017, much later than many of you here. But I started hearing people say trans women are women, and thought, are they? Don't think so. Right, okay. What shall I cut out? Okay, I'll just say briefly, the only party that has a policy of not adopting self-ID is the Communist Party. I don't think that's because they're really keen on women's rights, actually, sadly. But anyway, they're not going to get into government. The Green Party. Well, I won't go into all of the detail about the Green Party. I'll send out the more detailed notes. I'll move on to talk about my conclusions. Well, the Tories in April, the Tories will be considering the report from the consultation that they set up. We will be having another meeting here in June about just that. So we'll wait and see what the Tories' recommendations are. My conclusions are that Stonewall has been very, very clever, and I think we're now on to them, and a lot of people are challenging that ideology. Another thing that I think is quite significant for people who are working within politics is a lot of the resolutions on this issue are couched in terms of defending human rights for trans people, which nobody is going to object to, but then self-ID is thrown into the same resolution. So to oppose that resolution is you're subject to being accused of being anti-trans, and that happened to me a couple of weeks ago when I was arguing against a resolution. So I think we have to start splitting those issues, because we're not anti-trans, we're actually just wanting to defend women's rights. And I think we should congratulate ourselves for the progress that we've made, and the tide is turning.
Thank you very much, Diane.